you probably know about this, but new leaked documents this week coming out of Ukraine show Ukraine's generals had planned a middle of the night attack on Moscow to seek revenge on Russia on the 1-year anniversary of them invading Ukraine. It took, from what I'm reading, it took several people at the CIA, the State Department, and possibly even the White House going back and forth trying to convince them that this is going to end in nuclear retaliation or World War III. Were you aware of this attack? And what do you think would have been the outcome if Ukraine had launched this attack on Moscow unbeknownst to NATO?
Well, I wasn't aware of the specifics of the attack until the information came out. I can say that monitoring a variety of Ukrainian telegram channels and things of that nature, that there had been talk about something like this. I think it's important for people understand for people listening to understand that while we talk about a war in Ukraine, this isn't a war. If it was a war, this conflict would be over already. Russia's not at war with Ukraine. Russia is seeking a solution that keeps Ukraine from becoming NATO. War means the destruction of a nation. War means the total defeat of a people. And so I think what the United States and those who intervened were trying to tell the Ukrainians is, if you attack Moscow, there's going to be a war, and all of you are going to die. I just want to point that fact out. If this was a war, Zelensky would not be alive today. He would have been killed in week 1, week 2. If this was a war, Kiev would not exist as it currently exists, with a functioning government, infrastructure, things of that nature. Just ask the Iraqis what happened when we went to war against them. The first places we bombed were presidential palaces, parliament, the functions of government. Leaders became a command and control target, and we hunted them down. Saddam Hussein lived because every day he moved between different targets, different places. We were one step behind him. But I could personally attest, we were trying to kill him. I tried to kill him. One of my missions during the war was to kill Saddam. The Russians are not trying to kill Zelensky. They're letting him live. They're letting the Ukrainian government function because their goal is not the destruction of Ukraine. If the Ukrainians carried out this attack, and look, there's others that they're talking about. Right now, they're talking about sending drones to attack the Victory Day parade on March 9th. If they do this, they will die, literally, because Russia's not at war. But if you attack Moscow in the middle of the night on the first year anniversary, or on May 9th during the Victory Day parade, that is an act of war, and Russia will respond in the same. They may not use nuclear weapons. In fact, they won't use nuclear weapons against Kiev, but they will take Kiev off the grid. It will no longer exist. And then NATO may get involved, and now we have a nuclear war. So I think that's why the United States came in and did what they did, because the United States, with all the rhetoric that we have here, we understand that Russia is not putting everything on the line here, that this is still very much a limited military operation for Russia, that Russia's goal and objective is not the destruction of the Ukrainian state. If it was, this war would be over. The other problem for the United States is how do you build up a country like we did with Ukraine, elevate Zelensky to be the modern day version of Winston Churchill? I will fight them on the beaches, I will fight them in the shores, I will fight them, and then tell them, well, you can't.
Yeah.
We're going to pretend you're Winston Churchill, but you can't be Winston Churchill, because if you do that, you're going to die. And now Zelensky's looking reality in the face. Ukraine has lost the war, and everybody knows it. And so Zelensky's desperate for something that can change the algorithm, change the equation. And I think there's a lot of people surrounding him say that the best way we can survive is to bring NATO into the conflict. And the easiest way to bring NATO into conflict is to go to war against Russia. So, okay. Yeah, but I think I'll leave it with this. Dmitry Medvedev, a former Russian president, gave a speech yesterday. and I hope every American watches that speech, because there's a lot of talk in the United States about the Russians bluffing. You hear it on the media all the time. Oh, Russia's bluffing about nuclear weapons. They're shaking the nuclear saber, but they're never going to do it. Russia would never do that. And Medvedev said straight up, he said, look, I'm a former president. I will tell you right now that Russia is a nuclear armed nation, and the Russian president, and I was this way, must have a steady hand over the nuclear button, willing to push it at any time that it is required to be pushed. And he said, our doctrine clearly states that if somebody carries out operations that represent an existential threat to Russia, we will use nuclear weapons. And you need to understand there will be no hesitancy, no warning, no discussion, no debate. We will use them. So anybody who sits there and says, well, let Ukraine do this. Why not? It's a suicide pill. And remember, when Russia uses nuclear weapons, it begins what will always end up as a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, and we will all die. So that's why the United States intervenes so hard, because I don't think anybody in the United States in a position of power wants to swallow the Ukrainian suicide pill. And that's what allowed Ukraine to attack Moscow would come.
Okay. Oh, man, interesting. I don't in any way want to defend Putin with what I'm going to say next, but just my observation and my logic seems like he is the more steady hand than Medvedev. I don't speak Russian, but
Medvedev, yeah.
Is Putin good cop and Medvedev the bad cop, or is he just a little bit more wild in his thinking and comments than Putin? Because he's the one that's always like threatening, nuclear war, and Putin's like, okay, hold on, we're just going to keep going with the Russian doctrine.
Look, Medvedev, when he was president, was a very reasonable man. And the reason is, I think the position defines the man. And to be president of Russia is to be president of a world power with tremendous responsibilities. And Putin is a very steady, stable player. Medvedev has a different job today. And see, Medvedev can say things that Putin can't, because it's one thing to have the actual president say something. It's another thing to have somebody on the sideline say something. Medvedev, of course, is very influential. He sits on the National Security Council. He's a close advisor of Vladimir Putin. And so when he speaks from a position of authority, but not the ultimate authority. Gotcha. And so I think Medvedev's job right now, and I think he's relishing this job, is to be that crazy dog in the background, that crazy, snarling, foaming, rabid dog. And Putin's the guy holding the dog by the chain, saying, I don't want to let him go. I really don't want to let him go. Don't make me let him go. So that's his job. But I think if, for instance, Medvedev ever again became president, he would revert to more of a Putin style, because it's the job dictates the attitude, and no president would ever behave that way. It's irresponsible. Medvedev is far removed from the nuclear button, therefore he can make these talks. But remember, he is somebody who was president, and he is not going to be saying these things unless he has a green light from the Kremlin. So I think the Russian president enjoys him saying this, because it scares the living you-know-what out of people.
The judge was a patriot also, because then, of course, when the judge learned that, as Ellsberg was saying that, or the night before, the FBI broke into his psychiatrist's office to steal his medical records, and that was it for the government's case. When the judge threw it out in the middle of the jury trial, they didn't even appeal. They knew that they were cooked. They could not live with what the FBI had done. Bradley Manning would be in his sixth year of a 45-year term had President Obama, not commuted that sentence. And the same for Edward Snowden, had he not fled to Russia. Julian Assange, unfortunately, is in the clutches of some of the worst people in the world, who we call our allies in Great Britain. but these are people willing to take a chance. What's going to become of this young man? I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts before we get into some of the other stuff I want to talk to you about? Do you have any thoughts about whether the young man did this alone or whether he was an unwitting dupe of somebody north of him on the totem pole who gave it to him knowing he was sharing things with his buddies in the chat room?
I mean, well, it'll play out in the end. I personally believe that this was a young man who was trying to impress people with his access to information, that he wanted to position himself as a knowledgeable authority. Again, these are the kind of things that normally would come out in security screening and probably deny him the ability to hold a clearance. But I think he did what he did. I think that I think the system will find it in its heart to give him a lesser sentence. Look, we did the same thing to Clayton Lodentree, the Marine security guard at the embassy who fell into a sex trap, KGB sex trap, ended up letting a KGB colonel wander the halls of the embassy. He was given a very severe sentence, but later on, the judge came back and said this was just a lonely Marine who he wasn't trying to betray his country. He just did something that lonely men do often. And so they commuted a sentence. This kid is not a criminal. Okay, that's the first thing I want to say. He's not a criminal. He's a kid. He's a kid who did something immature. He shouldn't have done it given the security clearances. But the other thing is the system failed him. The fact that the system allowed him to do what he was doing means that his tendencies that had they been corrected early on, the first time he hit print, if his staff sergeant come over and said, "What the hell are you? Excuse my language. What are you doing printing this out? You can't print this out. I'm writing you up. We're going to put you on report. There's going to be remedial training before we allow you back in." That's what leadership. When I was a second lieutenant judge, I left a confidential slide on my desk as I was preparing a brief. I went home at night in a secure space. It was locked up, but I left a confidential slide on my desk. The counterintelligence people doing their sweep afterwards found it. I got written up, and I was standing tall in front of a general who was telling me one more mistake like that, and you are out of the Marine Corps. Now, fortunately, the Marine Corps believed that you allow people to learn from their mistakes, and I learned from my mistake. But my point is, the system took care of me, meaning they found my error and they corrected me in a way that I never again repeated that error. Wow. That's what should have happened to this kid early on. He should have been corrected.
This has been superb analysis of this, Scott, and we're all deeply grateful for it. Switching gears, are you surprised that our mutual friend Cy Hirsch has reported that William Burns, the director of CIA, sat down with President Zelensky and said to him, "We know your people have stolen $400 million in cash. Here's a list of 35 generals who've helped themselves to all of this. By the way, your name should be on this list as well, Mr. President." Are you surprised do you put credibility in Cy's reporting? Because the Biden administration has not denied or challenged this.
Look, I think I've made it clear that Seymour Hersh and I have a quarter of a century long relationship, friendly relationship. And every time I go to Washington, D.C., we get together, we talk. I am familiar with how he works. I'm familiar with his integrity. And if Seymour Hersh puts pen to paper and writes up like this, he has a source. And you also know that he has vetted his source. This is the guy that has reported accurately on so many things, not just My Lai, not just Abu Ghraib, not just Nord Stream, but look at all of his reporting in the New York Times, stuff that the U.S. government initially said, no, never happened, then had to turn around and say, yeah, it happened sort of exactly the way Cy laid it out. So yeah, I trust him. I trust everything.
Does the Biden administration know? Does Jake Sullivan know? Does Tony Blinken know? Does Lloyd Austin know? Does the president know that Vladimir Zelensky is a crook? Yes,
100%. They know it. And they facilitate it because that's the price of doing business in Ukraine. They know that's just why they don't allow an inspector general. This is why they don't allow audits, because they know how bad it is. So they can't even go through the process of pretending, because any inspector general came in, he'd go, "Hey boss, we're missing." And now they have to shut it down. So they won't even allow these investigations to take place. That's how bad this is.
So when Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky and Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky simultaneously Massey in the House, Paul in the Senate, introduced legislation requiring an inspector general on the ground in Ukraine, legislation that would have amended the blank checks that were given to Joe Biden. The Republican and Democratic leadership together would not let either of those proposals come to the floor for a vote. Why?
Because they knew if there was an inspector general, then the American people would say, why are we giving them $100 billion only to have 70 billion disappear into pockets? That's unacceptable. So they, and I'm telling you, all Congress is complicit in this. Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and everybody, they know the truth. They just are making sure the American people don't know the truth. And yes, I'm saying it. Congress is making sure the American people don't know the truth about Ukraine.
And that is the reason that Jack Teixeira will be prosecuted so aggressively, because the truth embarrassed and humiliated the government.
Well, the one saving grace for him might be that there's a lot of information that hasn't come out. And if the government chooses to, as they always do, overcharge and come up with multiple counts to intimidate him into making a plea, if he were to take it to trial, there's some information there the government doesn't want to bring to trial. And so, they may end up reducing some of the charges and some of the penalties on him. And I think if he has a good lawyer, his lawyer will be trying to cop a plea because the U.S. government doesn't want this stuff to come out. So, but the truth, Judge, you're 100% correct. The truth, they say, will set us free, but we have to have access to the truth. And we live in a time and a place when our government is lying to us on a daily basis, and they hide behind a wall of secrecy, and they make any American patriot who seeks to breach that secrecy and bring the truth to light to show the American people, they make them out to be a traitor.
My hat is off to you, Scott, as are the hundreds of thousands watching. Thank you very much, my dear friend. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.